appreciate the support in terms of these good food strategies that Rockefeller has so that we can make sure that the children are getting a nutritious meal.
Rockefeller Foundation and the American Heart Association are expanding research into the relationship between food health and health equity.
Bringing transparency and fair pricing to food, I think, helps people understand the real cost of food in society, how it impacts their neighbors, how it impacts their economy, and how food can be used as a tool for healing.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ryan Heath. I'm Global Technology Correspondent at Axios, and we're about to welcome onto the stage two distinguished panelists, and we are going to be talking about how to use data and other fantastic new technologies to reduce food insecurity. So without further ado, I would love to invite onto the stage Dr. Paul Romer, who's a very busy man because he has a new job. Welcome to the stage, Dr. Romer. You are now the Seidner University professor at Boston College, and you are charged with launching a new center for economic ideas. And amongst many other titles and achievements, he did win a small prize from a minor Swedish organization a few years ago. Don't know if you've heard it. I haven't heard about it. It's the Nobel Committee? Yep, that one. And then last but not least, we have Sara Menker, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Grow Intelligence. Welcome to the stage, Sara. Now, for those of you who don't already know her work, that makes her the queen of food security. And you have been augmenting human expertise with wonderful technologies like AI before any of us even knew what that meant. And we're going to dive into all of these topics today. We've got about 30 minutes for this discussion, and let's make it interesting.
Sure.
Now, Dr. Romer, you, in preparing for this panel, you said that we're facing major challenges, as big as the 1970s, possibly headed towards the scale of the 1930s. And while we do have ambitious global goals, the UN SDGs, at the same time, we're not really innovating across the board or achieving the productivity growth that we did in eras such as after World War II. And on the other hand, billions, trillions of investment in new technologies, but often directed at relatively trivial challenges, not the biggest social challenges and economic challenges that we face. So to tie all that together, I wanted to bring the topic of the moment, artificial intelligence, to this discussion. Is something like AI big enough and transformative enough to really reset those innovation dynamics, or is it some other driver or set of drivers that is going to get us to close these innovation gaps?
Well, we might disagree on that, which is good. That makes it more interesting. But I think AI is a kind of a fad and a distraction. I don't think it has any prospect of addressing whatever it is that's gone wrong. But I think we do need to start being honest that something serious has gone wrong, and it's gone wrong in a bigger way in the United States than in other places around the world. When I used to talk about the benefits of growth, and when I was the most optimistic economist in the profession, I would say, look at history, look at all the growth we've had, and here's this indicator of growth. It's hard to measure GDP in the year 500, but look at what's happened to life expectancy. Well, look at what's happened to life expectancy in the last 20, 30 years in the United States, especially relative to countries around the world. If that was our indicator of things going well, things are going badly in the United States. And we need to grapple with that and think hard about what's caused us to turn from positive to not only falling behind our partners, but negative. And then think about how do we address it.
And if AI is not the catalyst for a big leap forward, what would be?
Well, I think no technological silver bullet is going to fix this, because we've had lots of technological innovation. The problem is that technologies create possibilities. Some of those are good, some of them are bad. If you've got a government that can act on our wishes as citizens and say, don't let people do those bad ones, just do the good ones, then new possibilities is going to be good on average. But what's happened, I think, is we've neutered our government, we've incapacitated it, and it's lost the ability to say, even like under the Reagan administration, like chlorofluorocarbons that are gonna destroy the ozone layer? No, we don't want to do that. That's a great technology for some purposes, but it's going to destroy the ecosystem. So let's just ban them. And the Reagan administration banned the chlorofluorocarbons. I don't think an administration today could do that. And I think this is you see signs of this around the world, but I'm afraid the United States is out in front. So the bottom line is that you can't have progress unless you've got both technological innovation and a mechanism for expressing the collective desire to do the good parts and not do the bad parts. And it's that ability to express what we want and then carry it out. That's what's at risk right now.
So the tech doesn't work without the people, that's for sure.
Well, without the government. Let's not mince words about this.
Government isn't an abstract concept. It is a collection.
It's partly philanthropic actors, but also it's the job of the government to express what's in the interests of all of us rather than what's in our selfish interests. And economists have been terrible about bad-mouthing government and, like big government is bad and, government is the problem. And we need to just think about this much more carefully and much more clearly. And there's a job that only the government can do, and we got to make sure we've got governments that can do it.
Now, Sara, you've dedicated your life to eradicating food insecurity. What have been the biggest drivers of new insecurity since you started Grow Intelligence around about a decade ago now? And same AI question, really. Like, is the proper application of AI the way to make the Zero Hunger Sustainable Development Goal finally attainable?
So we agree.
Okay.
We don't disagree.
Oh, heck. Well, I take back what I said then.
Exactly. But it is, I think it's a lack of leadership, right? And leadership is required, whether in the form of government or as civil society or as individuals, to sort of drive progress forward. And so sort of thinking about what has made the world, so to answer the first part of your question, though, in terms of sort of what's made the world more food insecure over sort of the past, especially the past few years, I would say, the last 5 in particular, it's a few things, right? Climate disruptions have just become a lot more prevalent. The number of sort of climate shocks that are being experienced and the extent to which they're being experienced simultaneously in regions around the world is high. And the volatility, so one is the, sort of when people think of sort of climate change and when you talk in terms of degrees, actually people just think it's about warming, not about volatility. And volatility itself is very bad. And so the lack of predictability has definitely caused a significant amount of disruption in supply chains. And so therefore actually just fundamentally increased sort of the price of food. The second has been that production increases just simply have not kept up with increases in demand, which have been driven not because of economic growth alone, and in fact, the last few years was not an economic growth story, it was just purely demographics. If you look at regions such as sub-Saharan Africa or Ethiopia, where I'm from, 40% of the population is under 15. So you just from a sort of sheer sort of number of mouths to feed standpoint, that the production increases have just simply not kept up with it. Then you've had disruptions such as COVID, which actually created permanent sort of changes. So there were some that were shocks to the system that sort of recovered, and then there are other things that sort of fundamentally reshaped sort of the way our food systems are working. And then the final piece is China. China's become a structural importer of grains. That's a pretty large shift, considering it's the world's largest consumer and producer of sort of products, right? So I think they're sort of a confluence of events that have sort of made that happen. And then you had the Russia-Ukraine war, which really, frankly, highlighted the fragility of the systems that we were sitting on, and sort of how that's played out, right? And then when you think about, food security, I think a lot of people think in terms of dollars. They don't think in terms of local currency, which is how people eat. And you've had the strengthening of the US dollar over the last few years, not helping the case for food security, especially in food insecure countries, which tend to be net importers of food. So on top of sort of the disruptions, just sheer affordability of being able to import has become sort of fundamentally more difficult. So it's a range of, environmental, macroeconomic, and then geopolitical shocks that I think are sort of causing it. And no one of these things seems to be going away. They seem to just be replacing one with the other. Every shock just gets replaced with another shock.
So you might tell me then we have to do all of this at once, but where do you see the balance between...
So
Yes.
before we go on, let me try and just defend what Sara does, because
Yes.
she didn't do it. We're going to have to switch roles here. But data matters. Evidence matters hugely. And our ability to marshal more evidence and look at it in more innovative ways, this is a big step forward. What I think probably both of us would push back against is this idea that machines are going to just displace the people. You don't need a person in that loop evaluating what the data means. And this is just madness. This is crazy. Nobody knows anything about these models.
But what you do need is the data to map out
Sure.
across the supply chain to understand. Well, actually, this gets back to the question I was going to ask, which was there needs to be system change and behavior change, and that need exists prior to any particular technology existing. But then how much do you need the technology through smart agriculture to boost production, to measure where the climate impacts are going to be, to understand where the problems in the supply chain are going to be?
Yeah, and I think maybe going back to sort of your original AI question as well, I think, the term is very broad, and it's one of these things of like, about 15 years ago when big data was the term that everybody used and nobody knew what the size of big data meant. Was it a big spreadsheet, or was it trillions of data points, or what is the sort of definition of big data? AI is sort of in that world right now.
Yep.
It's in this sort of very broad world. So just to define it, there's sort of two forms of AI, and the AI that's become what I would agree is sort of like a fad today has actually been the horizontal AI space. So if you think of horizontal AI, that's ChatGPT, that's OpenAI, that's the work that DeepMind is doing, et cetera. The thing to remember about horizontal AI is that it's a reasoning engine. It's not a knowledge database. It's a word predictor that's able to sort of change the way in which we sort of do it, but it actually is not a knowledge graph behind it. So when we say, AI hallucinates, it's just making up an answer. It's lying, right? And the type of AI we do is vertical AI. And vertical AI is actually solving for some set of challenges backed by good data, where then you can sort of move things forward, but it is constrained to a domain. And so this idea of sort of truth, this idea of explainability, all of those things become sort of more possible. Not entirely, because there are things in the way that the models work where it's still hard to explain, but way more explainable than in horizontal. But actually where sort of horizontal and vertical coming together becomes powerful is now the way in which you deliver that information becomes way more accessible, right? Because horizontal infrastructure that sort of makes it work. So to answer your sort of question around the piece of, you still need people, and will AI sort of empower this, and how, what does that look like? One, you need people to be participating. You need domain experts in the AI world. Like, AI without domain expertise is dangerous.
Yep.
That's the first piece. And then the second is you need sort of the ability to sort of interpret and do something with that knowledge and sort of that data. And that's where sort of humans come in, where that's not going to be replaced, right? And that's where leadership also comes in, which is AI can tell you that a food crisis is coming and that you should, have a better national strategic reserves program, or that you should diversify your trading partnerships because you have dependency risk on a particular country, and if something were to happen, this is how it's going to play out. But it then requires humans and some level of conviction to then take action on it, right? So, and this applies to healthcare as much as it does to food security or really any other type of mission critical area.
And it was this second step that you're referring to, where humans come in, that I was referring to really when I talked about the problems of the government. It's these things require collective action, and collective action is very difficult to organize, and it's failures of collective decision-making that I think are what we're suffering from the most. But let me also just emphasize how important the domain expertise is in the very nice layout that you just gave. Ask yourself this question: would you rather get an answer about an important question, like go back to the 40s and think about what are the prospects for growing more food? Would you like to hear from a person who spent 5 years deeply immersed in this? Would you like to hear from 1 million people who've given like half a second to thinking about the prospects for more food? And if you know the history of the Green Revolution, the Rockefeller Foundation fortunately listened to somebody who was working on this problem, didn't look at the analog of Twitter at the time, because that would have picked out somebody like Paul Ehrlich, who was selling books about the population bomb. So I think we really got to take seriously this idea that there are people who are thinking carefully and people of integrity who dig deeply in. And there's a lot of other people who are just repeating the conventional wisdom that they heard from somebody else on Twitter. And there's no new information when you get 1 million people who are repeating the conventional wisdom as opposed to 5 people repeating the conventional wisdom. So, in the preparation for this event, I got all these instructions about how to, tweet and look. If this organization is going to use the retweets as the measure of the success of this event, you've lost your way, and you're not going to find the analog of Borlaug that you found once before.
Luckily, I think Rockefeller has many other programs. Let's call them their foundation policy models while we're on the AI theme. So I think that we're not quite lost yet, but the point is well taken. But this is a very important point. There are many types of AI, and I think we've all gotten caught up in ChatGPT because it is so expressive. It's literally a language model, and it connects with people, and it made us wonder if it's human. But there are other types of models that rely on explicit knowledge, like you've been explaining. They spot patterns, they identify relationships that no individual human possibly could, and they don't hallucinate because they're not trying to predict the next word. They're just analyzing what's already in the system, and that wasn't scraped on the open internet. So we'll all learn more about that over coming months as the ChatGPT hype dies down, but I really think we should all absorb that point. Dr. Roma, you have said very clearly that you're worried that a few tech companies have access to way more than just data and code. Right. It's not just AI, but it's across the board there. We've never entered a new tech revolution or tried to deal with a set of challenges like the SDGs present us with trillion-dollar companies and such a concentration of power before. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you're worried there and how we can break some of that down to give ourselves more policy options, more chances for action in the future?
Yeah. Economists have this notion of a market and why a market works. In a market, you offer to sell something to me, I give something of value to you, I look at the thing that I get from you and I decide, was that worth what I gave you? And if it isn't, I don't go back to you, I go to somebody else. If it is, I can keep dealing with you. None of those elements of what makes a model work are present in the current markets for digital services. We don't pay for Google search. Somebody else pays to try and influence what we see on Google search. Third-party payment is not a good way to run a market. We see this in healthcare. It's not the right way to provide digital services. And so the problem we've got now is not just concentrated power using traditional means of extracting monopoly rents. We've got very concentrated, very powerful firms pursuing a toxic business model based on surveillance and targeted advertising and manipulation of what people see and hear and know. And it's I think, a very threatening kind of force. I think you apply this to political advertising, and then you close the possibility of actually some kind of collective response to say, we don't want markets that work this way, that involve this kind of dishonesty, misrepresentation, surveillance, tracking. That, we don't want markets that provide services where the Surgeon General has to say, you better protect your kids from these services because it's going to ruin their lives if they get too hooked on them. So it's not just concentration, it's a business model which is just toxic, and it's unprecedented, and we really need to just say we don't want to live in that kind of a world.
And many people do say that, so I wonder if only government action is the answer. And I'll give you 2 data points to reflect on. First is Axios and Harris have a new poll out today of the top 100 brands in America. TikTok, Facebook, Meta, and Twitter are 94, 95, and 97 out of 100. It proves this exact point that people are asking for more and different, and they don't trust what they're getting. At the same time...
Sorry, those 3 were at the top of...
No, the absolute bottom, 94th,
the bottom. I see.
95th,
Yeah.
and 97th, alongside Fox, the Trump Organization, and the failed crypto exchange, FTX. So there's an indicator there about what people think at large about what those services are doing. Yep. At the same time, Meta is the top performing stock of 2023. It's more than doubled this year. Investors, so leave aside the government, but investors say they care much more about the cost cutting there than the reputational questions about the points you've just raised. Yeah. So the market and democratic debate isn't changing this, so maybe government has to.
I think that only the government. This is why I was emphasizing in the beginning, you've got to have a way that expresses, because government is us. Yep. The government is saying, we don't want to live in that kind of world where the mental health of our kids is at risk from the actions of these for-profit firms. And look, the shareholders at, I forget which chemical company it was, that was the kind of the biggest producer of the chlorofluorocarbons. Sure, they wanted to keep selling chlorofluorocarbons, but nobody in their right minds would have said, oh, sure, let's let them destroy the world because they'll get a higher rate of return on that particular stock. There's other stocks. We don't need to have people earn returns on things that are going to be so destructive. But I think the other thing that's important here is to just look at what a theory of action is, and you need incremental steps. You can't nothing big or important. Well, and the ban on chlorofluorocarbons is maybe a bit of an exception, and it extended worldwide. But we moved first in the United States and then spread around the world. I think the way to start on this targeted digital advertising is tax it. We can't ban it outright. I think these firms have way too much political power for that. Even if that's what we want, it won't happen. But we could start to tax it. And we could start to tax it at the local level. States could do this, cities could do this, other countries in the world can do this. And we can then incrementally shift them and tell them they have to shift to a model which is like the model for Netflix or the model for groceries. I mean, you pay a subscription or you pay, for the services provided. But this advertising model is second only to the model in pharmaceuticals, which is let's get them addicted to opiates. And that was probably a worse business model. But
to bring it slightly closer to the original topic of food insecurity, but I appreciate all of those points, and I think the room does too. Sara, there is a good news story from that poll that I mentioned. So John Deere, an agricultural services company, they're number 3 in the ranking, partly because they have moved much quicker into smart agriculture, and they make things, and they have got reasonably short supply chains, not the complicated ones that break down, that are sometimes too global. So I don't want you to comment on John Deere, but I wanted you to talk a bit about what are the least worst ways to fix some of the problems that we've seen in supply chains in recent years. How can we make the supply chains simpler or shorter or more traceable so that we are getting better food security results?
I love how you called it the least worst ways, as if there's like.
I mean, every action has consequences. I don't want to say that there's any solution, technical or otherwise.
Ray of sunshine and hope. See? So, I mean, in terms of sort of, I guess, handling and dealing with supply chains, I mean, one of the things that is sort of very clear is concentration risks that exist, right? I mean, both concentration risk in terms of where people are getting their food, as well as what we're eating, meaning sort of more diversified diets that are closer to sort of where you're from, as opposed to,
and does more diversified mean more vegetarian?
More diversified. In this case, if we're dealing with the basics and we're just dealing with supply chain issues as opposed to other things, like to me, even that sort of first step becomes necessary. But our food systems are not designed or even optimized for that. And we as consumers are addicted to cheap, right? So in the sense of just the trade-off between what that then implies for prices, at least in the short term, because the amount of investment that would actually have to go into the supply chains to repurpose them to undo basically what was built over the past sort of 50 plus years is not an insignificant amount of sort of investment. And you have capital markets. But
it's basically essential, isn't it? There's no way out of it. We're going to have to reconstruct the supply chains.
It's reconstructing itself. It's forcing itself upon us. But in that process, it's more expensive than it needs to be because it's being shocked into it as opposed to planned.
Yeah.
Right? The difference between the two is one is you're just being forced and you're doing it in smaller bite sizes, it's like swatting one thing at a time as opposed to saying like what does redesigning a system actually look like?
Yep.
And then who are the players we need? And you need participation everywhere from sort of the farm level all the way to sort of the markets, right? And you need policy to also be an enabler for that. And sort of thinking about what that actually sort of looks like. So it is, more quote unquote localized. You can't produce everything you need in every country. That's also impossible.
Yep.
But there's some happy middle ground that doesn't involve, 70% of exports coming from one specific country or, and we have just highly, highly concentrated supply chains that need some level of fragmentation to mitigate that risk, and that's doable. But it will
I'm seeing a concentration pattern across the industries and themes here. It's time for questions from the audience. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
Just one positive comment?
Yes, of course. Yes, absolutely.
Preceded by another rant.
A very short rant and a very positive comment.
Autonomous vehicles are the prototype of what the experience is going to be like with AI.
Yep.
They're going to make a lot of progress early on. Everybody's going to go, holy cow. And then you're going to find that on the last 10% of what you got to get working, it just doesn't work. But you know where autonomous vehicles are actually going to work and are already working? John Deere tractors.
Yeah.
There we go.
Out in the field, you can have a whole flock of tractors all working at the same time. But
just have to remove all the people.
Watching
all the jobs first, and then put the.
Having one of those vehicles, like figuring out whether it's okay to go through the crosswalk. That's not what I want. But.
Who wants to come to this crosswalk and ask a question? Yes, we got the woman in the orange jacket. If you say your name and if you're representing anyone, that would be great.
it on? Can you hear me? Liz Cook, World Resources Institute. First of all, Sarah, I love the vertical and horizontal explanation because we're using machine learning right now on early alerts on deforestation in the field, and it's working extremely well. So I appreciate that. Paul, you started out by talking about growth is not necessarily good. I'm just curious about what are you suggesting we have, and how do we sell that? Because that will help reduce pressure on the planet, simply said.
Well, I've shifted to trying to use the word progress because progress is possible. We've seen it historically. We could recreate it now. Progress will come from new discoveries, figuring out how to do even more with less in the way of resources and energy. And what do even more means is provide more satisfaction to people. It's not more kilograms of stuff, but it's more satisfying lives. So progress is possible. The usual metrics we use, like GDP per capita, are one indicator of progress, especially the trend. But I think there are just other indicators that you have to look at. And if you got a country where GDP per capita is going up, but life expectancy is plateaued and then is falling, something's wrong. You also have a country where a large fraction of adults age 25 to 54, the fraction of adults age 25 to 54 who have a job has fallen steadily since the late 1990s. And these are not rich people who've retired early. These are people who've been just completely discouraged and have given up, and young men. Not just them, but across the age spectrum, we've seen this growing sense of discouragement and a sense of a lack of progress in one's own life, a lack of agency, and so we need other indicators besides GDP per capita. If we make the right decisions, we can harness new innovations to provide better quality of life for everybody.
Final question over here.
Representing Philip Winkle. I saw it reported that in the wake of the pandemic, the collective revenue of the top 3 shipping companies exceeded that of the Build Back Better bill passed by this administration. In regards to your conversation regarding monopolies, the need to fragment the supply chain in government, what do you feel is the role of government in helping fragment that supply chain or making the supply chain more affordable?
Do you want to?
I can give it a try. It's hard. I mean, because I think the shipping company comment is right, but it's, if you think of the biggest component of that, it was fuel and the cost of oil. Right? So, and that sort of is one step removed. But going back to sort of the role of government, de-risking, right? So if you look at why the sort of U.S. ag industry is where it is, it was a set of deliberate decisions made post-Great Depression around what the role of the USDA would be in sort of ensuring food security for the U.S., right? And if you think of financing in the U.S. today and sort of U.S. agriculture, it's still largely backstopped by government, whether it's on the loan side or the crop insurance side, et cetera. It's not possible to that extent at global scale for reasons that I mentioned, including just the balance sheets of different parts of the world. But there are de-risking mechanisms that need to come into play for that kind of sort of fragmentation to start to occur, because the markets today are not positioned to be able to do it, largely because of the point I made, which is because what we consume is also so concentrated, very few of the sort of agricultural products we'd want to diversify to have even any form of a market that you can trade. Like, we have 8 things that we can trade on an exchange today, which is sort of your proxy for how deeply capital markets can be involved. So I think government and public institutions, I would say, would have to play a pretty big and catalytic role on the risk management and the risk mitigation side to allow for sort of that type of change to happen.
If I can just comment, we've actually seen remarkable technological progress in shipping because of innovations like the shipping container. You can move things around the world now, at a much lower cost, and the cost from coastal locations is often very low compared to the cost from the port to an inland location in developing world. So I wouldn't flag shipping as like the worst kind of bottleneck that we're facing. Though, well, one exception, of course, is that there's very little regulation of the pollution that ships emit, and we do need to fix that.
One topic we didn't tackle, but I do want to insert myself back in to do as a final question, is the relationship between food insecurity and national debt. And I don't know whether you would pin it on bad policy making at the global institutional level in terms of global lenders, bad policy making at a national level where people aren't choosing the right priorities inside the national budgets as they try and deal with rising debt, whether inflation and currency issues are a big factor there. But could you unpack a bit that relationship and what institutions could do to alleviate local leaders having to make bad choices between their debt and their food security?
First, I think that there's a long kind of line of work in economics that suggests that food, like hunger, is fundamentally a problem of poverty. And poverty is fundamentally a problem of distribution. On average, there's plenty of food in the world, or there could be if people could afford to buy it. There's plenty of other things, but we have economies and a global system, which means that some people have much less than others. So I would really focus it directly on the issue of, how do we address these issues of distribution and poverty? Debt is a side effect of the political paralysis that we see in many governments. Everybody wants to spend, nobody wants to raise taxes, and so debt goes up. But what's a kind of number that worries people in the United States right now? It's a debt-to-income ratio that's a little bit above 1. What do you think my debt-to-income ratio is?
Well, as a household, from a very high-earning household, yours is going to be higher, and you've got a greater capacity to service it.
Well, yeah,
and your bank isn't going to double your interest rate like the IMF does.
If you look at what most people can afford in a mortgage,
yeah.
They're
three to six.
They're going to have 3 to 6. Yeah. So this idea that we can't afford to pay for the debt is just like Looney Tunes, but it is a sign of the paralysis in the decision making.
I think there's more insecurity in other countries where governments have less capacity to pay back the debt.
Well,
don't have a choice if they're using the lenders of last resort.
What we've seen is crises when the lenders decide they won't pay. It's not that they can't pay, but in many cases governments can decide they won't pay, and then the possibility that they won't pay means you can get a freeze on lending. But I think I would say that the issues to think about are distribution and poverty, and then paralysis. And the paralysis is just we're not making decisions. It's either we're going to tax more or we're going to spend less. And to a certain extent, you can think of yourself as being on the top of a hill. It doesn't really matter which solution you come up with, but we should just make a decision. And it's that incapacity to make a decision which leaks into debt, and it should be the thing that should worry us, is we just lost the ability to decide.
Final word to you, Sarah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think maybe just sort of putting some numbers on the problem we, I think, sit on today from a global standpoint, which is you have a lot of countries that have borrowed money over the last few years where markets were searching for yield and interest rates were very low here, and issued a lot of foreign currency denominated debt at record levels. Yeah. So the last 10 years, you had record levels of foreign currency denominated debt being issued by a lot of countries. You, at the same time, over the last few years, have had those same countries experience rapid devaluations and depreciations of their current local currency. So their ability to service that debt has gone down significantly. And then you've had sort of food prices go up overall over the last 3 years. Again, if you look at the price of wheat year on year in the US, it's down 20%. The price of wheat into Egypt year on year is up 45%. And that is all currency. And so what you're starting to see is, if you do a y-axis of basically percentage a consumption-weighted basket of food for a country, how much that basket is up on a local currency basis over the last 3 years. And then on your y-axis, if you do a calculation of how much foreign currency denominated debt, mostly in US dollars today, is coming due in the next 2 years, the way that you see the countries fall down that sort of line that emerges is literally government after government that's falling. I mean, you have Lebanon at the far right of, I'm like imagining the chart because I know these numbers by heart, but the price of food in Lebanon is up 2,000+% over the last 3 years. And it also has about 25% of its GDP coming due in foreign currency denominated debt basis over the next 2 years. Argentina's at about 500%. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So the challenge in terms of your question of food security versus debt, that for net importing countries is becoming an increasing reality, which is, do I service my debt, or do I use the little foreign currency reserves I have, which is causing my currency to be devalued, to import and provide that as sort of a priority for importing food? And this is a constant challenge that country after country is now starting to face, and is something we're going to have to confront. The challenge with restructuring that you mentioned, and this is also what makes, I think, where we are today very unique relative to the past, is that most of this debt is sitting in the hands of regular bond investors. It's actually not in the hands of multilateral institutions at the scale it used to be, right? It sits in the hands of hedge funds that were seeking yield, or asset managers that basically had emerging market strategies. So it's a much more fragmented holding of debt that is going to be way more complex to sort of tackle than we have been in the past because of who the lenders are.
And more China than they used to be. So you're absolutely right, and it's very, very complicated. Sara Menker, Paul Roma, thank you very much for such a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining.